Again, welcome to the session, Meet the Inspector General, Fraud and Audit Awareness Briefing. Before I introduce you to our speaker, as a reminder, questions will not be taken during this session. However, as questions do arise, please write them down and submit them to the email address provided at the end of this presentation. Now, allow me to introduce you to today's speaker, Ms. Deborah Jeffrey. Deborah joined the Corporation for National and Community Service as Inspector General on July 19, 2012. Shortly after her confirmation by the U.S. Senate. She began her legal career as the law clerk for the Honorable Harrison L. Winter, Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. She holds a B.A. in Political Science from Johns Hopkins University and a J.D. from Harvard Law School, where she served as Editor-in-Chief of the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. She is the author of more than 30 appellate opinions and has written on the subject of professional responsibility, taught classes and seminars, and served as an expert witness. It is my pleasure to present to you Ms. Deborah Jeffrey.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is one of my favorite events because I always like talking to the people who are trying to get things right. I spend way too much of my time with people who've made the wrong choice or made a serious mistake. And so I always look forward to catching people as they're getting started and helping keep them on the right path. The purpose of today's session is threefold. The first is for you to understand what it is OIG does. The second is to learn something about preventing, detecting, and solving problems that we commonly find in corporation programs. And the third is so that you'll be familiar with how and when to contact us. Let's talk a little bit about the mission of my office. Its basic goal is to make the corporation operate better. By law, we have two particular charges. The first is to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of corporation programs and operations. And then the flip side of that is to prevent and detect waste, fraud, and abuse by three basic means. The first is conducting audits and investigations. The second is recommending policies to strengthen the corporation or grantees and their operations. And third, keeping the CEO and Congress informed about any problems that we find and the need for corrective actions and whether those actions have been properly completed. The first tool that we have, in many ways, the essence of being an inspector general is the concept of independence. By law, the Office of Inspector General is independent of the corporation, and that's relevant in a couple of ways. The first thing is we report directly to Congress, and we report administratively to the corporation CEO. I understand you heard an introduction from Wendy at the beginning of the conference. So while I work closely with her and keep her advised about what we're finding, really the folks who set my tasks are the people on Capitol Hill. To maintain our independence, we are funded by a separate appropriation. And it is absolutely key that all of our staff are objective at all times in the way we do our work, and we can't have any conflicts of interest with grantees. All of that is so we can really bring an impartial and objective view to our work and not be distracted by any extraneous or personal concerns. So what is it we don't do? Well, the main thing we don't do is manage or direct any agency programs or operations. My office can make recommendations to the corporation, but we can't direct them to take action. So if you have any questions about program or operational issues, those should go to the corporation, to your local state office, to your program officer. And why is it that we don't do those things? Well, that's because our fundamental role is oversight. Okay, we've talked a little bit about our job to promote economy and efficiency and effectiveness. We prevent and detect fraud, waste, and abuse. And since you can't review your own work, if we made decisions, we obviously couldn't be objective and impartial in evaluating our own decisions. So inspectors general throughout the federal government are hands-off on actually operating their agencies and just engage in oversight. By the way, there are 73 inspectors general in the federal government. About half of them are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. I'm one of those. And it's typically the agencies that Congress is most interested in / concerned about that have presidentially appointed IGs. The rest of the inspectors general in the federal government are selected by the head of their agencies. So the whole purpose of oversight is to have independent and constructive criticism to improve the way the corporation and its programs operate. And we do that through two operational units. Audits and investigations. All of you who watch cop shows on TV know what an investigation is. It's an inquiry in response to a specific allegation or evidence of misconduct. And because the corporation is a grant-making agency, typically the kinds of investigations we do involve fraud or theft or misuse of funds or a false statement to the corporation. So what's an audit? Well, many of you will never encounter an investigation, but you may from time to time encounter an audit. An audit is a general review to be sure that a grantee is properly handling and accounting for federal funds and complying with other program requirements. And the purpose of an audit is to identify and recommend the correction of any deficiencies so that the organization is stronger at the end of the day. We don't get brownie points for finding things. We try to decide who we audit on a risk basis, but we're not the least bit unhappy if we come in and find that an organization is operating very well and that there are few, if any, problems. So I'm going to repeat something that I know you all know, and that's that grants come with strings. The other way to say it is there's no such thing as a free lunch. So what are the strings on your grants? Well, they're the terms and conditions, the federal law and regulations, and there are the corporation's policies. And grantees are accountable for complying with all of those requirements. That's the first part. You have to comply. And the second part, number two, is that you've got to maintain the records to show that you've done so. I'll let you in on a little secret about auditors. They are very literal-minded people. And if there isn't documentation to show a fact is true, that fact is not true. Okay, that's the way they operate. So you need to maintain your records to prove that you've done all of the things that you're required to do. Here's a bit of practical advice to you. Make sure that you review the terms and conditions in your grant and the applicable rules and regulations. Don't just put them in a drawer and forget about them. You need to go back to them from time to time as you're making decisions about how to operate. All of this is around the concept of accountability, and as you won't be surprised to learn, in the current fiscal environment, accountability is really, really important. Congress is very concerned about making sure taxpayers get the most bang for their buck. The taxpayers themselves are resentful when they see waste or they see fraud. And so it's very important to show that you are operating in a responsible and efficient way. All right, so how do you get to integrity and accountability? What do you have to do so that you know that you are operating properly and can show that you've done that? Well, the first thing is you need to have systems and policies and procedures in place at the beginning of your grant to be sure that your organization operates within the rules. Okay, ad hoc decision-making, the one-offs, that's where people get into trouble. If you have systems and policies and procedures so that you know what to do when something arises and you follow those policies, you will stay out of trouble. It's like having the good habit of leaving your keys by the door when you come into the house. You always know where they are. If you have a system for dealing with timesheets, if you have a system for dealing with expenses, then you always know how you're supposed to go about your work. You do it that way regularly. Everyone follows the same rules. You'll be in good shape. And then the second piece of that, as we just said a moment ago, compile and retain full documentation. You might think, oh, nobody will ever need to see this. just be careful. Remember that it's your job to maintain the documentation that shows that you followed all of the rules. Basic ingredients of accountability. And this is something that you should make sure your organization does or has each of these things. Okay, number one, strong internal controls. So what are internal controls? It sounds like it's a technical term. It sort of is. But what we're really talking about are checks and balances that protect your organization against fraud and mistakes. So things like you require 2 signatures for expenditures above a certain amount, or somebody monitors charge card purchases, or you reconcile your bank accounts, or you have an inventory of property, so that you know that you're following the rules. Someone is looking at this to check and be sure. Those are internal controls. The second thing is written procedures and documented systems. Don't make it up as you go along. Have up-to-date rules and procedures, and it's not enough to have them written down and in a book or on a computer. You've got to actually follow them. The third ingredient is active financial management and review. Okay, that may sound intimidating to those of you who are not auditors or not accountants or not bookkeepers. I know that because I'm none of those things. My background is law. It's not in accounting. It's not in auditing. So I'm here to tell you, even if you are not an accountant or an auditor, you can understand your organization's finances and review them frequently. And make sure you do that, and make sure that the financial people in your organization explain things to your satisfaction. Ask questions, okay? Make sure you understand the flow of money in and out of your organization. So, fourth item, I keep touching on that because it's something we see so often as a problem, is that you should have accurate and contemporaneous record keeping. It's got to be accurate. The best way to have accurate record keeping is to make the records at the time of the activity. As we said, you not only have to follow the rules, you should have the records to prove that you followed the rules. You want to follow federal laws, regulations, and grant terms, obviously. But the last one I want to pause on for a minute, tone at the top. That means leadership has to set the right tone and send the right message in the way you conduct your daily affairs. All right, if you communicate to your staff that these rules are a nuisance or a pain or sort of beside the point or secondary to how your program operates, you are not going to have people following your rules. You want instead to present accountability as a core value of your organization. It's integral to everything you do. So you need to say that, and you need to behave that way. And that's the way to make sure that all of your staff understands and follows the procedures that are going to keep them and you out of trouble and keep you a successful grantee for the long haul. So let's pause for a moment and talk about the problems that we find frequently when the Office of Inspector General audits grantees. Okay, a lot of these problems can lead to very serious consequences. They can be including disallowance of costs or requirements that a grantee repay grant funds. So what I'm going to try to talk to you about is not just here's the problem, but what you can do to prevent this from happening, or at least to find it early if it does by accident happen. First thing is, if you've got multiple grants or multiple programs, you've got to account for them separately. Okay? Different grants involve different activities and expenses. Make sure you can show which expenses pertain to each grant. The money shouldn't all go in one big pot to be used as needed at any particular time. You've got to keep the funds separate. The second is submit your federal financial reports, your FFRs, on schedule. And for Senior Corps, they have to be submitted semi-annually, and there are deadlines for doing it. And one of the things we look for, one of the things the corporation looks for, are organizations that can't manage to get their FFRs in on time. If that happens routinely, we say to ourselves, gee, we think there may be a problem in the way this organization operates, and that's going to get you you additional scrutiny by the corporation. Twice a year, make sure your FFRs reconcile to your internal accounting records, okay? Make sure that what you're telling the federal government about what you've spent for the grant is actually consistent with what your internal records say. You would be absolutely astonished at how often we go and do an audit, and we find that a grantee has drawn down and reported they've spent $100,000 more than their internal records show they've spent on a program. And then we go ask for that $100,000 back. So you want to be very careful to make sure your information is consistent in all of these places and that you are reporting accurately to the federal government how much you are spending on each program. As you also know, a grantee should only draw enough federal funds to meet current expenses, okay? You don't draw down all the money on your grant and have it sit in an account, for a rainy day or just in case, and then draw interest on the difference. You are supposed to draw only for your immediate expenses. A rough rule of thumb is you don't take the money unless you have to spend it within 3 days. That's just a general sort of guideline. In terms of reconciling these federal financial reports to your general ledger, I don't expect the program folks to do those reconciliations. That's a bookkeeping or an accounting function. But make sure your accounting staff shows you that they have done that reconciliation when the FFR is submitted, and that they can explain the differences to you, because there are sometimes differences resulting from timing. But don't let them leave your office until you understand. It is not that hard to understand, and if they can't explain it to you, that tells you you need to dig a little deeper. It's a more common audit problems that we find. Make sure the timesheets are completed accurately and on schedule, signed by a supervisor after completion, and timely submitted. And it might seem obvious to you that a supervisor shouldn't sign the timesheets until the staff member or the volunteer has filled them out completely. But it's not always obvious to all of your people in some organizations. I mean, the timesheets exist to show that the activities were permissible under the grant and were actually performed. And so make sure your supervisors understand the responsibility of signing them. When you sign a timesheet, the supervisor is certifying that the work took place. So they can't be signed until all of the work is completed. No advanced signatures. Sometimes we will find timesheets that have been signed by a supervisor in blank. Okay, that's an indication of fraud. And we take that very seriously. The second piece here is timesheets can't be based on budgeted amounts. They have to show the actual time somebody spent. Timesheets aren't estimates. They are a statement that this is actually what took place. Okay, so if the timesheets are not properly completed, the hours and the costs must be disallowed. So this is one it pays to be very careful about. All right, so how do you know? How can you make sure? Well, you don't have to wait for my auditors to come in and do an audit. In fact, you shouldn't. Periodically, you can conduct your own timesheet review or audit. So review the timesheets for 1 to 2 pay periods to be sure they've been done properly. We recommend that you begin early in the grant cycle so that you can find any problems and fix them before they snowball into major problems. Follow up to ensure that corrections have actually been made, and provide additional training or reminders if your review shows there are real problems. Sometimes it's necessary to change a timesheet after it's filled out. You should not, when there's a correction that's needed, you should go ahead and do it. But show clearly what change has been made. Make sure it's initialed and dated by the individual and the supervisor, and note the reason you had to make a change. It can happen. Somebody can confuse 2 days, or they're a day off on their calendar or something like that. We know that happens. But just indicate that you recognize there's a change here, that it's noted, that there's a reason for it, and that a supervisor has confirmed that the change is appropriate. Be on the lookout for timesheet fraud. If you've got a bunch of documents that look like they were all prepared at the same time, you've got timesheets with pre-printed hours, and we sometimes see that. And we talked about timesheets that are submitted and or signed by a supervisor before the end of the period that they cover. Those are timesheet fraud. Those are all examples of timesheet fraud. And as a sanity check for your staff, if you have staff charging time to multiple grants or multiple programs, add up all of their time and make sure it's not more than 100%. You can't charge 75% of this employee's time to one grant and 75% of their time to another grant. And that's logical, but you'd be surprised how often people can make that mistake. Another set of common problems, and this is a very common one. Congress has been very strict about requiring checks of the National Sex Offender Public Website and criminal history checks. And stop and think about it. If you were sending your child or grandchild to a school or to a camp or to scouting activities, you'd be outraged if you found that the school or the camp did not make sure that all of the people who came into contact with your child didn't have a problematic criminal history. But people feel the same way about service programs. Congress requires these checks to make sure that neither the public nor volunteers are harmed in the course of national service. So make sure you understand exactly what has to be done. And the rules are complicated. Make sure you know what they are and confirm with your program officer or your corporation expert if you have any questions. The corporation has terrific resources to assist you in these things. I think they are talking about adding to those resources further. But this is a very common problem that we find in audits. And if somebody hasn't done the checks, those are serious audit findings. The second thing in many senior core problems, in senior companions and in foster grandparents, there are income eligibility requirements. Okay, so that's another thing you have to check up front. All right. And there are specific legal requirements in some of these cases to maintain original documentation to show that these searches have been done and the date on which they were done. So these are threshold eligibility issues. If the checks aren't performed and documented, grant funds can't be used to pay staff and volunteers, and the expenses have to be disallowed. You can't just say, oh, well, gee, we didn't do the check until 3 months in, but that's no problem. The check came out okay. This is not a no harm, no foul situation. You do the check before somebody is on the payroll or on the clock. Any funds paid before a thorough check is completed are considered improper payments, and the corporation has an obligation to recapture them. That was a major finding of the audit that the corporation itself did of improper payments. They found that there were a lot of problems with these background checks, and so we're asking everybody, please be particularly careful about those. Okay, and this is another area where it is useful for you to do your own review. And again, because these are threshold issues, do it at the beginning of a grant. Pick a certain number of volunteer files, pick a certain number of staff files if you've got a large staff. Go through and make sure all of the proper checks were done using the correct databases, because they're databases that look like they may be okay, but in point of fact, they don't comply with the corporation's requirements. If you have questions, ask program staff about it. They can help you get this one right. More common problems that we find, make sure if you are subject to a match requirement, and most cost reimbursement programs are, make sure that you record match dollars in the general ledger with the same detail or documentation that you would for grant expenditures. Every now and then we find a grantee that says, oh, it's just a match, that we don't need to keep the detail on those. Actually, you do have to. Doing it correctly is important to show that you're entitled to the federal funds that these match. Document the source of the match contributions. And I want to highlight the third item for you. Sometimes you'll get in-kind match. Somebody may donate office space to you. They may donate equipment. They may, hold a fundraiser for you. They may give you something that is not cash and that you want to count towards your match. That's perfectly fine. In fact, it's wonderful. But make sure that you can substantiate the market value of those in-kind contributions. So if you get office space donated to you, you've got to figure out, show me comparable office space and how much did that cost? So how do we know this is how much that office space is worth? Make sure you've got it documented in your files. Please, I beg you, document all reimbursable meals and travel, okay? And you show the actual, not estimated amounts, okay? These are big costs in a lot of senior corps programs. Please substantiate the costs. I mean, one thing you might do, you might have your volunteers do, is to note on their timesheet whether a meal was provided and to note their travel expenses that they incurred on the timesheet. We've had grantees where their foster grandparents were getting meals at the school, and the organization has no record as to whether a particular person got a meal on a particular day, and there's no indication about why they valued it at $4. Now, it may be that the school system says, on average, our school lunches, will have a market value of $4. Well, just get a copy of that and make sure you have it in your file, so it shows why you documented it that way. Make sure the individual foster grandparents indicate when they've received one of those meals or when they've incurred travel expenses for which they've been reimbursed. Again, without the documentation, we've got to question those costs and they may be disallowed. All right, the basics. So first of all, remember I told you not to put the grant documents in a drawer and forget about them. Well, here's number one. Know what expenses the grant does and does not cover. Okay, take a look at it periodically to be sure that only allowable expenses are charged to the grant. Remember, okay, grants can't be used to fund your other organizational activities, even for the short term. If you borrow from these grant funds to fund unrelated activities, that is actually a serious criminal offense. Make sure you have receipts for those allowable expenses. And we talked a little while ago about you should only draw enough to meet your current expenses. You shouldn't be holding large sums of federal funds or drawing in advance. We look for certain patterns that may indicate problems. If all or most of the funds have been drawn down well before the end of a grant year, that makes us ask a question. It's not necessarily improper, but it's kind of a red flag that tells us we want to dig further. Or if there's a flurry of expenditures at the very end of the grant to use up unused funds, because that makes us wonder whether you're in fact using that money for another purpose or another year, not for the current grant year. So we look for those kinds of things. You should look for those kinds of things in your organization and make sure that they don't indicate a problem. Okay, if you have an indirect cost rate, know what expenses are included in it. Some of you will not have indirect cost rates. There's a lot of change around this legally in some changes generally made throughout the federal government for the administration of grants. But if your organization does have an indirect cost rate, know what's in your overhead versus what is a direct cost that can be charged to the grant. Be sure that you're not charging the grant directly for expenses that are covered by the indirect cost rate. That's double dipping, and it's not allowed. And I want to take you to the last point, which is the most basic point. make sure you have a list of who your current volunteers are, what they're doing, where they're serving, and who's supervising them. Okay, now for foster grandparents and senior companions, your payroll records are going to capture a lot of that information, but not all of it. But whether or not they have that, when someone shows up at your organization, you really should know who your current volunteers are and where it is they're serving. You'd be surprised how often we go to a grantee and they have kind of a list of everybody who served in the last 5 years, but they can't tell us who's currently serving. And obviously you would need to know that in the event of emergency. You need to know it for your own internal purposes, and we expect you to be able to show that to us if we come to visit your organization. Some of you are going to have the misfortune to confront dishonest conduct within your organizations. Sometimes some people are just fundamentally dishonest. They're just bad people. Other people may act under financial pressure, or in the heat of the moment, they do the expedient thing instead of the right thing. Sometimes people act to cover up a mistake, and they make the problem worse. Any dishonesty that relates to a federally funded activity is by definition serious, and it is very likely criminal. Okay, it is almost certainly fraud. Okay, so any kind of dishonesty, that should have your antenna vibrating. And just so you know, most people are honest. I firmly believe it. But sometimes dishonesty occurs in the places you would think it's least likely. I heard a story recently about an employee who had worked for an organization for 20 years, had a wonderful record of employment, was productive, was helpful. She was highly trusted by the organization's leadership, and it turned out she was embezzling money, because she got herself into some financial difficulties. She didn't know what to do. She didn't have other resources. And so she started kind of dipping into funds with the hope that she'd be able to replace them. And it just didn't work out that way. So really, you can never be absolutely sure, and that's why you need to check. You need to review your finances and your expenditures. So I'm going to give you a few examples of dishonesty and other serious misconduct, but I do want to tell you the human mind can be endlessly inventive when it comes to ways of committing fraud, so these are really just examples. Okay, the first one is misuse of grant funds for non-grant purposes, even temporarily. Okay, you can't borrow money from your grant to fund other activities. Drawing down funds on unoccupied volunteer slots. We talked a little bit about timesheet fraud, falsifying entries on the timesheet. People can say they've served more hours than they've actually served. Sometimes you'll find, the ghost employees, people who aren't really there, but they're nevertheless appear to be on the payroll and collecting money. Some of the most serious examples are embezzlement and theft. People can make an inflated expense claim. They can charge personal expenses to an organization. They can take unnecessary or luxury travel, personal travel sometimes, and charge it to the organization. And in audits over the past few years, we've encountered every single one of these things. I hope you will never see them. I hope your organization will never face those problems, but you do need to be aware of them and be on the lookout for them. So what should you do if you actually find evidence of fraud or dishonesty? So the first thing I'm going to say to you is report it right away to the Office of Inspector General. Okay, contact us. All right, we can give you advice about how to proceed. You're not trained investigators. That's not what your expertise is in. Okay, our investigators can help you understand what documents to gather, how to preserve evidence, whether you need to preserve computer records, when, whether, and how to talk to somebody you suspect of serious misconduct. And often your inclination may be to go to this person and get them to explain. Sometimes that's not the right thing to do. You want a trained investigator to help you figure out what the best way to proceed is. Another form of assistance that our investigators and auditors can provide is to analyze financial records and trace funds. That's not easy. It's especially not easy if somebody who's financially sophisticated has tried to hide their tracks, but that's something our folks are trained to do and they're experts in. And we can recommend measures to strengthen your internal controls and prevent this from ever happening again. Our goal is not just to figure out where dishonesty happened and go, catch the bad guys. It's also to make sure that your organization is stronger so that you are protected from any recurrence. But the bottom line is it's very important to talk to people who have capabilities, skills, and resources that your nonprofit may not have. So don't try to do this on your own. One of my former colleagues used to say, don't do brain surgery on yourself. When there are experts available to help you, you should make sure that you take advantage of that. So why should we ask you why do you report? Well, for one thing, it protects the integrity of federal programs. We all have an interest in making sure that taxpayer funds are spent the way they should be, and to show that every program cares about integrity. Reporting early stops the bleeding, and it allows the organization to recover from misconduct. When you find something yourself and you assist in correcting it, that's much better than when somebody else finds it after it's been a crisis. And let's be frank, if you don't report, you're condoning misconduct, and somebody may think you were complicit in it. Or, with apologies to Johnny Cochran, if you condone it, you own it. So make sure you report very quickly if you see indications of dishonesty or fraud. You may think that you've seen only a single small thing, and you may be inclined to kind of let this one go or just talk to an employee. But you may not know this may be only the most recent in a pattern, and you really do need to consult with somebody who can help figure that out. All right, so what are things that you should call to OIG's attention? I'm going to give you kind of the rough laundry list. Fraud, theft, or embezzlement. Okay, intentional misapplication or misuse of government funds or property, false or fraudulent claims or statements. Okay, a false claim is usually a presentation of something for payment, so like inflated travel expenses or vouchers, those are false claims. A false statement is any untrue, any deliberately untrue statement that's made to the federal government hoping the federal government will rely on it. So it doesn't mean the government has to be deceived. The government doesn't have to have been injured by it, okay? But you've got to tell the truth in your dealings with the government in all respects. The last piece is obviously forgery or falsification of records relating to grants, and the kinds of things we all worry about, corruption, bribery, or kickbacks. OIG is the only part of the corporation that has the jurisdiction and the experience to investigate these potentially serious crimes. So notify us right away if you see any indication of this kind of misconduct. Most of you will never confront it. I hope that this doesn't happen in your organization, but in case it does, I do want you to know where to go and what to do. Okay, so how do you report? Well, one way you can report is to the Office of Inspector General hotline. Okay, we have a toll-free number. You can also report by email. All of the information is confidential. We can protect your identity. Okay, we will not quote give you up. You can report anonymously. You don't have to give your name, and we don't trace emails to the hotline. But we would like for you to tell us who you are or to call us back in a day or two, because often we'll have follow-up questions. And it's very hard to follow up on information if we don't have complete information. We've received allegations from time to time that said there is X problem happening, but if you aren't specific about where it's happening, that doesn't give us much to go on. So while you don't have to leave your name, we would very much like for you to leave your name. And we are experts at protecting your identity. I don't believe there has ever been a leak from my office about the identity of someone. If you see something that doesn't fit right with you, that itself is worth reporting. You don't have to be 100% sure that what it is wrong. Often we get calls and we talk to the person and we do a little looking and we say, you know what, you didn't see the whole picture. As it happens, they did the right thing here. Everything's perfectly fine. And that's a good thing. Don't hesitate to pick up the phone and let us know. We don't think less of you for it. In fact, we appreciate people being careful about it. So what happens to somebody who has reported misconduct, whether it's to OIG or to the corporation or within your own organization? Well, by law, you cannot be retaliated against, for reporting waste, fraud, or abuse. The law is designed to encourage people to come forward without fear of adverse consequences. You can't be fired, demoted, or otherwise punished. That's true even if you happen to be wrong. As long as you didn't make a bad report with a malicious purpose, even if what you saw or what you think you know turns out to be incorrect, you cannot be retaliated against. And by the same token, for those of you who are supervisors, you can't retaliate against anyone in your organization for reporting to OIG or to the corporation. We should all be encouraging people to do the right thing, to come forward, to express their concerns. That is a really important way to protect your organization and to protect federal funds. So we said a little while ago, we can't take questions in this presentation, but I want you to know this is my personal email here. And so you should feel free, if you have a question, send it to me. Please caption it in the subject line question, and we will respond to it either to you personally, or if it's a question of general application, we'll ask the corporation to post it. So with that, I'm done. I'm really pleased that so many of you are concerned about these things and interested in learning about them, and I hope this has been helpful to you. Please do not hesitate to call on me personally or on my office for assistance. If you are ever involved in an audit or investigation and you have questions about it, do not hesitate to pick up the phone and call me or zap me an email. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Again, please email questions to the address provided, and in the subject line, state question, and Deborah will respond back to you. Thank you for your participation. This concludes today's presentation.